My own daughter looked straight at me, and pretended she didn't know who I was. I thought she was ashamed of me. I was wrong. The truth broke my heart, but not in the way I expected it to, not in the way that hardens something inside you. It broke my heart open instead, in a way that taught me something about love I don't think I would have learned any other way. My name is Laura Evans. I'm 42 years old, a single mother, and I've worked as a waitress at the same diner on the edge of town for almost 12 years now. I work nearly every day, mornings mostly, sometimes doubles when the tips are slow and the bills stack up faster than I'd like. It's not glamorous work, and I've made my peace with that a long time ago. I've spilled coffee on strangers, cleaned up messes that weren't mine to clean, smiled through exhaustion so deep it settled into my bones, and I've done it all for one reason, and one reason only. My daughter, Sophie. Sophie is 16 now, and she is, without question, the best thing I have ever done with my life. She's an honor roll student, has been since middle school, the kind of kid who does her homework without being asked twice, who reads ahead in her textbooks just because she finds the material interesting. She wants to be a doctor. She's wanted that since she was maybe 9 years old, sitting beside me in a cramped emergency room waiting area after she broke her wrist falling off her bike, watching the doctors and nurses move through the chaos with this calm, focused competence that clearly left an impression on her. She's talked about it ever since, pediatric medicine specifically, because she says she wants to help kids the way those doctors helped her that night. I have never doubted, not for 1 second, that she'll get there. Her father left when she was 2 years old, and it's just been the two of us ever since. I won't pretend those years were easy. There were stretches where I worked 6, sometimes 7 days a week just to keep the lights on and make sure Sophie had what she needed for school, tutoring when her math grades dipped in 7th grade, a new laptop when her old one finally gave out right before finals, the small, constant expenses that add up faster than any paycheck from a diner job can really cover. I never complained to her about it. I never wanted her carrying the weight of my exhaustion on top of everything else a teenager already has to carry. I just worked, and loved her, and told myself that whatever sacrifices I made now would be worth it when I watched her walk across some stage one day in a cap and gown, or better yet, in a white coat. About 4 months ago, something started to shift between us. Sophie, who used to talk my ear off about her classes and her friends and whatever book she was reading, grew quiet. She stopped asking me to check her homework the way she used to, stopped sitting with me on the couch after my shifts to watch our shows together. She'd come home from school, disappear into her room, and barely say more than a few words to me for the rest of the evening. I told myself it was normal teenage behavior, the kind of pulling away that happens as kids get older and start craving independence. But it felt different than that. It felt colder, more deliberate, like she was building a wall between us brick by brick and I had no idea why. The night everything came into sharp, painful focus started like any other shift. I was working the evening rush at the diner when a group of teenagers came in and took the corner booth, loud and laughing the way groups of high schoolers often are. I recognized Sophie immediately among them, and for a moment my whole chest lifted with that particular warmth you feel seeing your child unexpectedly, even in the middle of a busy shift. I walked over with my notepad, smiling, ready to tease her a little the way I sometimes did when I caught her out with friends. But before I could even say her name, Sophie looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something careful and guarded, and she said, flatly, "Sorry, I think you confused me with someone else." The words landed like a slap, though I did my best not to let it show. I felt my face go hot, felt something twist painfully in my stomach, but I kept my professional smile in place, apologized for the mix-up, and took the table's order like I would for any other group of customers. I finished my shift that night on autopilot, replaying the moment over and over, trying to make sense of it. When I got home, Sophie was already in her room with the door closed, and when I knocked gently and asked if we could talk, she said she was tired and had a lot of homework. I sat outside her door for a long moment before finally walking away, and that night, lying in bed, I let myself cry for the first time in longer than I could remember. I was certain, absolutely certain, that my own daughter was ashamed of me, ashamed of the uniform I wore, the job I did, the tired, aging waitress who couldn't give her the kind of life some of her classmates seemed to have. I thought about all those years of double shifts, all those sacrifices, and for the first time, I wondered if it had all somehow still not been enough, if I had somehow still failed to give her something she needed. The days that followed were some of the hardest I can remember, and not because anything dramatic happened, but because of the quiet. I found myself replaying every parenting decision I'd ever made, wondering where exactly I had gone wrong. Had I let her spend too much time around kids from wealthier families at school and made her feel the gap between our lives more sharply than I realized? Had I said something once, offhand, that made her feel like our situation was something to hide rather than something to be proud of? I went through old photographs one night, looking at pictures of Sophie as a little girl, holding my hand tightly at the county fair, beaming with pride whenever I picked her up from school in my old, dented car. She never used to care about any of it. I couldn't understand what had changed, and the not knowing was almost worse than any answer could have been. A few days later, I found myself near Sophie's school a little earlier than usual, having picked up a rare morning off and deciding to surprise her with a ride home instead of letting her take the bus. I parked near the side entrance where students usually gathered while waiting for rides, and that's when I overheard two girls talking, standing close enough to my car that I couldn't help but catch every word, though at first I had no idea the conversation had anything to do with me. One girl, a voice I didn't recognize, was laughing about something, and then I heard her say, clear as day, "Did you see Sophie's face when we brought up her mom again? She looked like she wanted to disappear." Another voice responded, something about how funny it was, how they should go back to that diner again sometime just to watch Sophie squirm. And then the words that made my hands go cold on the steering wheel. "Your mom is just a waitress," one of them said, mimicking a taunting tone, clearly repeating something they'd said to Sophie before, something they found endlessly entertaining. I sat frozen in my car, listening to the rest of it unfold, piecing together, with a growing horror, that this wasn't a single unkind comment. This had been going on for months. A group of wealthier kids at Sophie's school, kids whose parents drove nicer cars and lived in nicer houses, had apparently decided, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything Sophie had ever done to them, that my daughter's mother working as a waitress was something worth mocking, worth weaponizing, worth using to make my brilliant, kind daughter feel small in front of her peers. They had even gone out of their way, more than once, to visit the diner specifically, to watch me work, to make comments loudly enough for Sophie to hear, just to see her flinch. Everything clicked into place at once, sitting there in that parking lot, and the ache in my chest transformed from something bitter and hurt into something entirely different, a fierce, aching love mixed with grief for what my daughter had apparently been silently carrying for months without ever telling me. She hadn't pretended not to know me because she was ashamed of me. She had done it because she was terrified of what those kids would do if they saw further proof of the connection between us, terrified of giving them more ammunition, more moments to humiliate her in front of everyone. She had been trying, in her own quiet, misguided 16-year-old way, to protect me from having to witness that cruelty directed at both of us, and to protect herself from more of it. I didn't confront her right away. I sat with what I'd learned for a couple of days, thinking carefully about what I wanted to do, because my first instinct, the protective mother instinct that flared up hot and immediate, was to march into that school and demand answers, demand consequences, make a scene loud enough that everyone would understand exactly what those children had been doing to my daughter. But I've learned, over years of raising Sophie mostly on my own, that the loudest reaction isn't always the one that helps most. As it happened, the school reached out to me around that same time, an invitation to speak as part of their upcoming career day, one parent representing each of a range of professions for students to hear from directly. I almost said no. Some tired, wounded part of me wanted to hide, wanted to avoid standing in front of a room full of teenagers, including the very kids who had apparently spent months mocking the exact job I was being asked to represent. But then I thought about Sophie, about the fear she must have been carrying every single day, and I realized that hiding was exactly the wrong thing to do. So I said yes. I stood in front of that auditorium a few weeks later, dressed simply, no different than I would for any regular shift, and I told them the truth, plainly, without embellishment and without apology. I told them what it's like to raise a daughter completely on your own, no partner to share the load, no family nearby to lean on. I told them about working 14-hour days more often than I'd like to admit, about the exhaustion that settles so deep into your body it becomes just another part of who you are, about counting tips at the end of a long night to figure out whether we'd make rent that month. I told them I never once considered giving up, not because it was easy, but because every single one of those hours was in service of something I believed in completely, which was giving my daughter every possible chance at the future she was working so hard to build for herself. I told them that being a waitress isn't a lesser job, that showing up every day, tired or not, to do honest work that supports the people you love is one of the most respectable things a person can do with their life. I watched the room while I spoke, and I noticed, near the back, a cluster of well-dressed kids who had gone completely, uncomfortably silent, kids I recognized, without ever having met them, as the ones who had been tormenting my daughter. I didn't call them out. I didn't need to. The silence in that room said more than any confrontation ever could have. A few days after that assembly, Sophie came home from school looking different than she had in months, lighter somehow, like something heavy had finally lifted off her shoulders. She didn't say much about it directly, but that evening she sat with me on the couch again for the first time in what felt like forever, and we watched our shows together, and it felt, for the first time in a long while, like we were finding our way back to each other. The following weekend, Sophie came into the diner again, and this time I noticed her walking in with the same group of friends from before, my stomach tightening instinctively, bracing myself for another cold dismissal. I walked over to take their order, notepad in hand, my professional smile already sliding into place out of old habit. But before I could say a word, Sophie stood up from the booth, right there in front of everyone, and wrapped her arms around me in a hug so sudden and so complete that I nearly dropped my notepad entirely. "She's my mom," she said, loud enough for the whole table, and honestly the whole diner, to hear. "And I'm proud of her." The diner went quiet for a moment, that particular kind of hush that falls over a room when something real and unscripted happens in the middle of ordinary life. I stood there holding my daughter, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes that I did nothing to hide, feeling every single exhausting double shift, every skipped vacation, every worn-out pair of work shoes suddenly feel worth every bit of the cost. Children don't always know how to protect the people they love. Sometimes they're simply scared, carrying burdens quietly because they don't yet have the words or the courage to ask for help, and mistaking silence and distance for the only protection they know how to offer. I misunderstood my daughter for months, convinced she was ashamed of who I was, when really she was trying, in the clumsy, frightened way of a 16-year-old, to shield us both from cruelty she didn't know how to fight. Have you ever misunderstood someone you loved, mistaking their fear for something far colder than it ever actually was?